There's been pushback on this idea that a scrappy young historian is coming along and saying that these women scholars who created the field, really, might not have been right about the periodization.
This is the Drive-By History Podcast. Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Ken Magos. On today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Katharine Lee. Now, viewers will remember Katie from our episode on the Battle of Monmouth and her thoughts on a certain water-carrying legend. Let's get to it. Katie, I'm so glad you're able to join us today. I'm so excited to talk with you, and we miss you here in New Jersey.
I miss New Jersey too, and it's great to have another opportunity to do Drive-By History.
Absolutely. Well, I really hope we can get you back for a live episode soon as well.
Absolutely.
But in the meantime, we give our audience a chance to get to know you a little bit better. So I'm curious. I'm always curious about the trajectory for somebody who goes on to become a professor in history. Did you always have an interest in history when you were a child? Is this something your family talked about?
I did. I come from a big Southern family, and history is important in my family. So since I was a small child, anytime we would go to Louisiana in the summers and see all of my grandparents' family, and everybody would talk about the history of our family, the part of Louisiana we're from. My mom's family's lived in the same small town for generations, so the family history is really deep. And you would find out that this rocking chair was made by somebody in our family before the Civil War, or the chocolate pie we make at Christmas is my great-grandmother's recipe. Or we would always go and visit the cemeteries, and there'd be stories about, well, this great uncle did X and such. And so history was really present for me as a child, and I was always interested in the idea of history.
I love that. You know what you just made me think of as well? Sometimes I think people think of history as what exists in a book or something that's dry. Every one of us grows up with oral history, the traditions that are passed along, the stories. I mean, my family's gigantic and everybody has a story about somebody or something that happened.
I think that's part of what people forget is history really is just stories. It's just stories about people who lived a different time in a different place. And so the way you tell the same story every year about your great uncle who always told the same joke at Thanksgiving, or we do that in my family at least.
We do in mine as well.
History is just on a bigger scale.
Absolutely. Did you end up getting a degree in history when you did your undergrad then?
No, actually. My undergraduate degree, I was an independent major.
Okay.
I went to Grinnell College in Iowa, which is a small liberal arts college, which has a strong emphasis on students sort of charting their own intellectual path.
Love that.
And so my major was essentially American studies, but I welded together American history with anthropology and sociology to try and really understand the sort of social trajectory within the United States and how what I would now describe as social history developed in the United States. And so I was essentially a glorified history major, but on paper, I was an independent major.
I love that. Did your senior year culminate in some kind of a thesis paper that you had to synthesize the information you gathered?
We had to do a senior research seminar, and I did mine with Sarah Purcell, who is one of the greatest historians I have ever had the pleasure to know, about women's involvement in the pre-revolutionary boycott movement. And how specifically tea as a cultural touchstone became this rallying point before the revolution, that there's a misunderstanding that the tea tax before the revolution was actually a large tax. And in reality, English imported tea, even with the tax, was still cheaper than the stuff that was being smuggled in by the Dutch. But the English were so offended that it was being taxed at all that they refused to buy it. And so my senior thesis was about how women specifically drove this boycott movement and why tea as a cultural item inspired this very strong political reaction among colonists, but specifically among women.
We have an upcoming episode about the Greenwich Tea Party, which is one of the 4 or 5 that I can think of off the top of my head tea parties. Why are we only aware of the Boston Tea Party? Do you have any thoughts on that? Why is that the only one that kind of survives in the zeitgeist?
I think mostly because people who became big names in revolutionary history, like Sam and John Adams, were involved in the Boston Tea Party. So the Adamses were good at PR, and they did a good job of selling their own legacy as being involved in the revolutionary movement. And I think, too, because the British were so upset at the wanton destruction of property, that the Boston Tea Party became a real moment of escalating the revolutionary tensions. The Greenwich Tea Party, which I write about a lot because it was women, was made fun of in the London press. There were political cartoons openly mocking the idea that women in the colonies were stating political opinions and that women were protesting. And so it was downplayed in a way that the Boston Tea Party actually escalated tensions with Parliament. It greatly offended people in London. And so I think it became part of the bigger story of the revolution in a way that the other tea parties around the colonies just didn't get that same kind of attention.
Interesting. Okay. So make sure you have somebody famous attached to your event.
Yeah.
Because they'll get you the PR. But that's fascinating. So women are really playing a major role in what you're talking about here. I'm very curious because we talked about women's role in the American Revolution when we were at the Battle of Monmouth. I can speak today. I really can. And I recently did an event down in Ocean Township, very near the site of the Battle of Monmouth. And I asked everyone assembled there were about 50 or 60 folks, probably my age and older, said, so how many of you think that Molly Pitcher was real? Almost to a person, they raised their hand. And I said, but what if I told you she wasn't? And they're like, well, you're wrong. Yeah. And I said, well, I happen to know a historian who disagrees with you, and you all need to watch our episode on that. It's so funny to me that people are so adamant about holding on to those beliefs.
What's interesting, women were hugely involved in the revolutionary movement, but most of the iconic women we attach to that movement either didn't exist or they didn't do what we think they did. Because Betsy Ross is a good example of a woman. She did not make the first American flag. Like, we all know that's not true. And yet it's still what she's remembered as doing. And she's so much more interesting than that. She was an incredibly successful business owner. She worked in furniture making and upholstery. She did make flags, but she didn't actually make the first one. But what's interesting is that as both a married woman and as a widow, she developed one of the biggest and most lucrative upholstery businesses in Philadelphia, which for a woman in her period was more impressive than making flags. And we never remember that. But again, having a famous person attached to your event, her children and grandchildren were very invested in selling the story of Betsy Ross, which is how that story got told and became part of our badly remembered revolutionary history.
Yeah, almost reimagined in some ways. We talked when we were together about the centennial, the 1876 celebrations, kind of rewriting some of the Revolutionary War history. Because in some ways they wanted to make people look more heroic. They wanted to stress certain themes. I don't know. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the centennial was right at the beginning of the Gilded Age. And the Gilded Age was a period in which, for the middle and upper classes, women were being pushed into a very limited social role. And there was a big distinction being drawn between working class women who had to be active and had to literally work with their hands, but also had to be out in the streets and mix with men and have a very different life because they worked. Whereas middle and upper class women were defining femininity by being restricted, by being inside the home, having a very genteel, very limited lifestyle, by focusing more on being attractive and having the kind of social graces, being able to play the piano and make good conversation. And these were becoming the sort of hallmarks of femininity, which is very much reflective of it being post-industrial revolution. And in this period where we start to see class matter in America in a way it never had before. So during the centennial, that dynamic gets read backwards. And it gets read onto colonial women who in reality did not face nearly any of the social restrictions that women faced in the Gilded Age or the Victorian era in the United States and Europe. Women in the Revolutionary period, even wealthy women, were extremely active in their communities. They were socially and politically active. They moved freely through the community in an open way that women weren't doing by the late 19th century. They were opinionated. They were well respected for their points of view. Women in the colonial period were very, very public. But that's not what Gilded Age women thought made for a proper, genteel lady. So a lot of that just gets completely erased. And you either have blue stockings like Abigail Adams, who are held up as being unusual for their time, or you get women being pushed into these kind of supporting positions where women waved their men off to war. But we lost a lot of the history of women just on a day-to-day basis supporting the revolutionary movement, supporting the boycotts, writing pieces for newspapers, and having a political voice. We lost sight of that because it didn't fit the idea of gender that people were comfortable with in the 19th century.
No, it's fascinating. I'm also curious, is that one of the reasons why, as we enter the 20th century, women are now wanting the right to vote, they're really working toward gaining rights, that there was so much pushback from other women?
Yeah. My students are always shocked when I talk about the anti-suffrage leagues and how many women were involved in anti-suffrage movements. But yes, you get this kind of idea from a lot of times middle-class women who are very desperately trying to establish themselves as part of the upper middle class and the kind of genteel circles, that they don't need to vote, they don't need to work, they don't need to be actively involved in what happens because they have men to do these things for them, and they're trying to align themselves with this sort of wealthy perspective. Although the daughters of the elite in the Gilded Age absolutely wanted to vote. The daughters of J.P. Morgan and the Vanderbilts and these kinds of women were actively in support of suffrage. But you have this strong middle class of women who felt like women's suffrage, women going to universities, women starting to practice medicine and law was threatening an idea of gentility that they were trying to become part of. And those are the women that fought against suffrage.
So women end up getting the vote. We're now into the 1920s, and the idea of what women are allowed to do. I mean, it was certainly a different era in the 1920s, but it then leads to the 1950s where you're back to that same idea of mom's home baking cookies, waiting for the kids to come home, cleaning the house, everything's perfect. Can you talk a little bit about that trajectory? How did we it's almost whiplash.
One of the things, again, that I talk about with my students starting in the 1920s is we see almost consistently in American history progressive movement forward and conservative backlash. And we see that dynamic with the 20s to the 50s, the 60s to the 80s, and then the 90s moving forward. And part of what happens in the 1950s is the 20s are this sort of madcap decade. And women are gaining new opportunities. People of color are gaining new opportunities. The economy's high. Everybody's doing great. And then the 30s are a disaster. The Depression's hard on everybody. Everybody struggles. The 40s are a decade that are both successful and difficult. World War II is a huge national trauma, but the economy pulls itself back together. You get all the GIs coming home at the end of the war, and people want to get their lives back on track.
We've got a post-war boom, really. I mean, it's not just the economy doing well, it's doing fantastic.
Yes, there's a huge post-war boom. There's the production boom, the consumer boom, the housing boom. Yes, everything's doing great after World War II. And what you see in the 1950s is, again, kind of an ideal. There's this wonderful book called The Way We Never Were about the 1950s that really challenges the degree to which the ideal was true for people. But still, there's this ideal that life has finally gotten back on track. After 20 really hard years, America's trying to sort of reset. And that reset looks like what we think of as middle-class suburbia, where mom stays home, dad goes to work, there's 2 kids and a dog, and everybody is extraordinarily placid.
Well, yeah, and I would argue also that the advent of television and the programming that's being put out there is it's cementing that stereotype.
I remember asking my grandmother one time if she vacuumed in a dress and heels and pearls like they did on Leave It to Beaver. And my grandmother said that she did wear dresses, but not those kinds of dresses. I mean, she wore house dresses. She was comfortable. But even to some degree in the 50s, people knew those TV shows weren't reality. It was very much an ideal. But it was the idea that after the Depression and the war and all of the struggle, that America could find this kind of settled, prosperous lifestyle that was also supposed to be countering what they thought was happening in the Soviet Union. It was also a way of showing that America had these very strong middle-class core ideals. But of course, those ideals didn't allow for people of color, for single women, for anybody who wasn't kind of middle-class, white, and Christian. So it's a very specific and kind of limited ideal.
On the cusp of civil rights. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. You get the civil rights movement, you get the labor movement, you get the women's rights movement, you get a lot of people rejecting the 50s suburban ideal.
Yeah. So I'm curious. Let's go back to your education a little bit, though, because now I'm curious, what made you decide to go on and pursue your PhD in history?
When I went to college, I assumed I would teach high school because that was my only frame of reference for what people did with history as a living. And I was in college for about one semester before I realized that teaching college seemed like a much better idea than teaching high school, and that was really what I wanted to do. But then I got to the end of college and I had interned for 2 summers at McFarland Library at the University of Tulsa. I'm from Tulsa. McFarland has a wonderful special collections that has papers from a number of prominent European authors. It's a very impressive collection. And when I was home for the summers, I worked there for 2 years. And I was sort of interested in library science. I was interested in history. I was a little bit unsure what I wanted to do. So I got my master's at TU and I worked at the library for a year. And that was enough to figure out that I didn't want to be a librarian. And I definitely wanted to stick with history. So I finished out my master's there and I took a year off because I was completely exhausted. And I think a year before grad school is a really good idea. But sort of working in a library and seeing what that really looked like and realizing that everything that I liked about the archives was the history, that it always for me came back to the history. Maybe decide that I wanted to go ahead and get my PhD, that I wanted to teach at the college level, and that was really, of my many interests, really where my heart was.
So what was your focus as you were getting ready to present your thesis? What were you interested in studying?
Well, my master's thesis was about Benedict Arnold's wife. Yeah.
We hear nothing about Benedict Arnold's wife.
Right. So Peggy Shippen Arnold. The Shippens were one of the wealthiest families in Philadelphia. And interestingly, during the Revolution, they were neutrals. But she is heavily blamed for sort of seducing Benedict Arnold into his treason, which is historically completely unsupported. But a lot of what's been written, I think in an effort to find some reason that a man like Benedict Arnold would have become a traitor, pins it on him sort of doing what Peggy wanted him to do. And because her family was neutral and because they were very wealthy, she had socialized with British officers when they occupied Philadelphia. So she knew John Andre, the British counterpart to the treason. And there's this whole myth that she's basically at fault. And I was very interested in trying to figure out what history can really tell us about that. So I did my thesis on Peggy Shippen. And by the time I finished that, I was fully committed to women and the Revolutionary era, but also beginning to realize that history is very, very badly told. So I was looking for a graduate program that was strong in women's history, but would also be strong on 18th century history and let me try to work on an area that's not a really big area of scholarship. There's not a lot of historians looking at women in the late 18th century in America. So I went into grad school actually thinking I was still going to keep focusing on the boycott movement. And then, as tends to happen in grad school, my interests grew and my dissertation wound up being bigger than that. But really, it was coming to fully understand how badly we understand that era. maybe want to do my PhD on women in the 18th century and try to be a bit of a corrective to our poor understanding of what women were doing.
Did you find that you were having to sift through a lot of misinformation? I can see from your smile, definitely. Yeah.
Yes. Well, something that's frustrating is historians in different fields don't always talk to each other. So some of the things that women's historians know about the 18th century historians don't know about women. And scholars aren't always good at reading across the sort of disciplinary lines. So a lot of what gets written about the revolution is poor women's history. And then women's historians have made what I think is a really big mistake of assuming that women weren't doing anything interesting in the 18th century. So women's historians tend to start focusing on the 19th century, even though one of the big arguments in my dissertation is that the roots of women's political identity in America is in the revolution. It's not actually in the antebellum period. Women were articulating a clear political identity 50 years before we really give them credit for doing that.
That's interesting. Did you get pushback from from other history? I can see you nodding.
My advisor, Nancy Hewitt, who is a 19th century women's historian, she mostly writes about women in the abolition movement, was completely on board with my argument. But because a lot of the really prominent early women's historians are still living and are still sort of making their own arguments, there's been pushback on this idea that a scrappy young historian is coming along and saying that these women scholars who created the field really might not have been right about the periodization. So I've gotten a fair amount of pushback on the idea that women were clearly and specifically political by the 1760s, as opposed to the 1820s or the 1840s, depending on where you want to start looking at the women's rights movement.
But as a younger historian, you also have access to much more material immediately. You don't have to travel someplace to go do your research in a dark library basement, in the volumes that no one has touched for 30 years. A lot of this is available. I got this idea from Rich Veit when I was talking to him, because he was saying, in his study, especially with the archaeology, when he finds something he can't recognize, he immediately puts it on his Facebook page. And within 10 or 20 minutes, someone's identified it. Where in the past, he would actually have to go to the library and look through volumes, try and find something. Does this match? Is anyone ever going to know what this is? It's really quite amazing. So you actually have at your fingertips things that these older historians who've probably established their scholarship didn't have.
This is absolutely true. I had access to things in the British archives that had been digitized. That I didn't get to go to England, which was the downside.
Yeah, I'm sorry that you didn't.
Yeah, I didn't get to go to London for 6 weeks. But for about $200, I was able to get people to scan and send me things. And probably that was better in the end. So yes, having access to digital archives or to people who would scan things made it much easier to cast a wider net with my research. I think part of the difference too is that I approached the idea of how women developed a political identity by looking at the way women were political on a much broader scale. So women start to assert a narrowly political argument in the 1820s with the anti-slavery movement, when women start to hold anti-slavery conventions as women. And they start to say that we as women, for these specific reasons, object to slavery and think we have a right to political protest. And that's been kind of the idea of what it means to be political. But if you look at what women were doing in the 18th century, what women were saying is that we as citizens have a right to be political. And we are interested in these concerns because we are women. But it's a very clear political argument that's being based on membership in their communities and the idea of citizenship, not the idea of women's political identity. But it is absolutely political. It's just a different way of sort of saying why they have a right to be political. So if what you're looking for is the idea that we as women make a political argument, that's not what they're saying in the 18th century. They're saying we as members of this community or we as citizens make a political argument, which in many ways is where the women's rights movement gets to 100 years later.
Right.
They were sort of jumping ahead a bit in the way they described their rights. But the political argument's there. You just have to look for it being made in a different sort of a way.
I'm curious, was there a disparity between those political arguments in the North in the 18th century versus in the South? Was there as much disparity as we see in the 19th century?
Probably.
Yeah.
Probably. My dissertation focused on Philadelphia for a number of reasons. Partly that from central New Jersey to Philadelphia is easy access. Partly because Philadelphia was very cosmopolitan. The archives are extensive for women in a way that they're not in some other places through luck as much as anything else. More has been written on women in Boston than Philadelphia. So we know a lot about what women were doing in Boston. Philadelphia was very accessible for me. Women in the South were, I imagine, every bit as opinionated and involved, but we don't necessarily have as much historical record of that.
Okay.
Partly because we're already by the 18th century seeing that women are less educated in the South. So the way they would have expressed themselves and left records are going to probably be less than what we have in the North. Philadelphia also has a very long tradition of women's education, which made it a good city for me to work on. Women in the South were being, by the late 18th century, educated in different ways. And I suspect women in the South were vocal in their political opinions, but not necessarily leaving behind as much evidence as what we saw for women in the North.
Do you think that that's because of where a lot of those populations originated, where they started in Europe when they moved over? Was it they just were more insulated? I'm just curious because we think of the Northeast as being more progressive even back then.
And the Northeast was. It also was because it was more urban, because it was more diverse, because there was
a trading center as well. I mean, there was a lot going on. Yeah.
Yes. So women's education was preparing them to be engaged in a broader society and to be capable of communicating with people outside of their immediate circle, to be willing to express themselves and to participate in a more active sort of world. By the late 18th century in the South, you see the plantation system is beginning to define women's options. So women were, the stereotype that plantation women were very quiet and demure is not entirely true. Southern women were extremely opinionated, but they also moved in very small circles. So when we have letters for Southern women, we see them expressing themselves very clearly on political issues. But those letters existed in much smaller groups and haven't always managed to survive into the modern day.
That's interesting.
Less educated women in the North who are being trained to work in family businesses, or if they were lucky, possibly have opportunities to become governesses and do something with their education. Whereas less wealthy Southern women were just trying to marry the younger sons of plantation families and move up the ladder. Right. So you see generally Southern women having less of an investment in kind of putting a political point of view out there. But I have no doubt that they were every bit as opinionated as women were.
It's a shame that those letters aren't more readily available. Imagine what you would discover.
I know. I think it would be fascinating to know what women had to say in the South about a lot of what happened in the 18th century.
Oh, yeah. Well, maybe that can be part of what you do next.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe it'll surface at some point. Yeah. So I'm curious, talk a little bit about you're at Southeast Missouri State University. I had to look on my cheat sheet here just to make sure that I got it right since I did the initials wrong before. Talk a little bit about the program there and what drew you to the university.
We are a comprehensive regional university. So Missouri is not like New York or California. The state universities are not all linked, but there is the University of Missouri in Columbia, and then there are 6 or 7 comprehensive regional schools. So we pretty much only draw students from the southeastern part of the state. From Northern Arkansas and Illinois a little bit, but we really very much have a local student body. And our sort of mission is to provide a high quality education for a regional student body. So our students are almost all from the Boot Heel and the southeastern part of Missouri.
Okay.
But we started out as a normal college in the 19th century and then developed into a full range university that pretty much, has a very rural, very small town Missouri student base, but people who are very committed to this part of Missouri. And there's a lot of long alumni support in the area. So SEMO is an extremely popular school in this part of Missouri.
Sounds like you have a very strong community there as well.
We do.
For the student body and probably for the faculty as well.
Mm-hmm. We do. It's very rural. And so Cape Girardeau is literally the biggest town between St. Louis and Memphis. We're the big spot on the road.
Yeah.
But it means that a lot of students stay in the area and they funnel their families back into SEMO. And in the same way that people in New Jersey feel about Rutgers, people in this part of Missouri feel about SEMO.
No, that's interesting, though. Yeah. So are there any research projects that you're working on right now that you can tell us about? Any books that are coming up or anything that you're... No pressure.
Not really.
Okay.
I do have some ongoing research, but I decided a few years ago that while I enjoy research, that what I've always really wanted to be is a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And so I focus more on the classroom. I've been involved in a number of student conferences at SEMO and doing a lot to support student research. I do a lot of public presentations because I think it's important for good history to be out in the community.
Yep.
And so while I teach at SEMO, I actually live in Kansas City now.
Oh.
Yes. So at the end of the 2022 school year.
Last year?
Yes.
A year ago?
No, 2 years ago.
2 years ago. Okay.
The time all runs together. At the end of the 2021 school year, I had the opportunity to convert my position to a fully online position.
Oh,
so
wow.
I teach fully online now. And I moved to Kansas City, which is where a lot of my family is. So once I moved up here, I started working for an early education literacy nonprofit called Lead to Read Kansas City.
Oh.
And that's mostly what I do with my time now outside of teaching. Because one thing that I've really come to understand being in the classroom is how there are huge educational deficits that are starting very early. And I see the result of those deficits with kids coming to college and who have low literacy and low academic skills. So I teach for SEMO. I do research in my spare time, but most of my non-teaching time is focused now on working for this nonprofit and working with early elementary students on trying to build strong literacy skills so that they'll have better trajectories going forward.
I love that. So you're a teacher 24/7, really?
Pretty much.
I love that. That's fantastic. Yes.
History to the big kids and reading to the little kids. And it's a nice combination.
Well, they're never going to get to where they need to be on the, as college students without it. So
Yes. And the literacy gaps have increased since the pandemic. We're seeing growing issues with low literacy in both students, but also in young adults. And those problems ripple out into many, many areas in people's lives.
I'm teaching at Kane now and dealing with the college students who have been, away from class over the pandemic. It's been very, very interesting seeing the issues that are arising. Yeah.
Yes. And those issues are going to be with us for a lot longer, I think, than anybody thought.
I think you're absolutely right. Well, I think it's incredibly important that we get the word out about how important history is. I'm glad that you are a proponent for it. Our show obviously focuses on history because we think it's important for everyone to understand that regardless of what divides us, we're part of the same shared fabric at some level. Can you talk a little bit about, if you have an opinion about it, why shows like Drive-By History are important?
Absolutely. One of the classes I teach for SEMO is Missouri history. And I'm not from Missouri, so I had to learn a lot of Missouri history, but unexpectedly, it's one of my favorite classes to teach. Partly, I have all of these students who went to school in Missouri. They took Missouri history in middle school, and yet they come to realize how little they know about their state. And I find that students or adults that I give talks to are fascinated by their local history. So much of history actually happens on a local level. We talk about history as national events, but most of what really drives history is what happened in towns and local communities. So shows like Drive by History that focus on history on that smaller level and show how history happened in the places where you live, or how big national history happened in a specific way for smaller groups of people, is what I think really connects people to their history and makes people understand that history isn't just this gigantic series of events. History is made up of millions and millions and millions of small things that happened with normal people just like us. One of these days, I tell my students, we are going to be somebody's history. History is made by people just like us. And I think shows like Drive by History that focus on the local history and the smaller events and the way America's history played out in this town or for this group of people is what really grounds people in the idea that history matters and history is relevant and history is still living with us today in the lives we live.
Well, and the success of our show is due in no small part to wonderful educators and communicators like you. Having you come on our show and share your expertise is the greatest gift.
I have loved everything I've done with Drive by History.
Well, we hope we can get you back very soon. Our audience knows they can learn more at our website, drivebyhistory.org. Katie, thank you so much for talking with us today. It has been an absolute pleasure seeing you. I just can't wait to see you in person.
Yes, I hope to see you soon, and I had a wonderful time talking with you.
Thank you so much. All right,
Thanks.
We'll see you soon.